There are a few aspects of Istio related to security. For me, by far the most important is the concept of mutual TLS. The reason this is important is I believe this can benefit most professional Kubernetes projects. We'll be talking in detail about it in this session, but the sneak preview on this is really any project that is deploying to multiple nodes could definitely benefit from mutual TLS. Well, of course, I'll be talking in detail about what problem this aims to solve. We'll look at what mutual TLS is, and we'll see how we can enable it in our Istio system. This is definitely a big win for many projects that we get almost trivially from Istio. It's a few lines of YAML in the end and a really useful feature. Now we're going to need to do some talking because there's a lot of background to this, and we need to talk about whether you need this feature on your projects. I strongly suspect that the answer to that is yes, you probably do need this on your projects, but we'll need to talk about it to understand why. The end result of this video is that it's only going to be a few lines of YAML that you can apply once for an entire project and forget about it. But it's going to be probably a massive win for many projects. I would say really all but the most trivial of projects is going to benefit from having mutual TLS switched on. This is not a security course, and I'm certainly not a security consultant, so I'm going to be talking at a very high level of detail here. If, for example, your project needs to get PCI certification so that you can handle credit card data securely, then this is not the course for you. You need a specialist consultant in that field. So with that caveat in mind, as I say, we will be talking at a high level of detail, but I hope to convince you that this feature from Istio could be a huge thing for you. So I need to go all the way back. As I say, I won't go into deep details, but we need to establish some principles. I'm sure most of you will already be familiar with the concept of either HTTPS or SSL or TLS. Now I'm going to use those three terms almost interchangeably, even though they are different terms, they have different meanings, but for our discussions to treat them the same will be fine. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, but this is where we have any kind of a client who's going to have a conversation with a server, and we want the conversation between the two to be encrypted. So a long established protocol for doing so is HTTPS. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the concept of HTTPS. Almost all professional websites will implement this. So of course this is whenever you have the padlock enabled on any site, such as the Istio site. With that padlock in place, I can be sure that any data I send from my client to the server is being encrypted. So anything I put into a form on that page, credit card numbers, the obvious one, usernames, passwords, that kind of thing, all of that data is being encrypted when it's being sent to the server. Now we don't need to go into detail of how it works. HTTPS is the protocol where the client's going to request a certificate from the server. That server will contain the server's public key, and the client can use that to determine whether the server is to be trusted or not. When that process is complete, then this is where the TLS part comes in. The TLS is going to encrypt the data that's being sent to the server and the data that's being returned back from the server. All of that is a long established standard, and it's achieved by the server having a certificate which has been issued by a certificate authority that the client can use to do a validation. Well, I really am skating over the top of it there, and I'm sure I've offended many people, but that's going to be good enough for here. The key thing is we have a secure connection between the two. And the big thing to keep in mind is the purpose of this. I think many people outside of IT don't understand what they're getting with that padlock really. It's there to prevent so-called man-in-the-middle attacks. And this is where a hacker is able to intercept this communication somehow. So the somehow is, I have no idea how they would do that. I'm not a criminal, so I don't need to know. But it could be something as simple as somebody outside your house This communication could start as a wire coming out of your house, going to your local telephone exchange. A hacker could dig that wire up, cut the wire and put an interceptor in it. Or they could hijack any of the routers or routers used along the way. Although this is a simple line, of course, this is going to go through many data centers. So there could be a criminal working for one of the data centers who decides to intercept this traffic. Well, as long as we've got HTTPS on, we know that all of that data is totally encrypted all the way along the chain and all the way back again. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. On this course, we're not interested, though, in securing websites. What we're interested in is the security of a cluster. So going back to my picture, we've got a cluster here managed by Kubernetes. We've deployed many pods to it. And at the moment, by default, we're just using simple HTTP for communications between the pods. Now, my question for you is, do you care that the traffic between your pods is unencrypted? Now, I don't want anybody to watch this video and think I'm saying, well, you don't need to care. My answer is actually yes, you should care. And yes, I think it probably, almost certainly, in fact, is a bad thing that currently, without doing any work, we're sending unencrypted traffic between our pods. But what I'm asking you to do is to think of why. It's a bad answer, I think, to say, well, you know, it's security, isn't it? We need to have it on. You need to understand the reasons why HTTPS would be far more desirable inside your cluster. Now, the reason I'm saying that a lot of people, I think, would think, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the traffic is unencrypted inside the cluster. And the reason for that is something we're not addressing on this course is the communication from the user's browser doesn't generally go straight into the cluster. You probably almost certainly know that usually it will go to a load balancer, something like AWS Elastic Load Balancing. Doesn't really matter though. Whatever cloud platform you're on, there's probably a load balancing solution, and that tends to be used to get traffic into a Kubernetes cluster. This part of the equation is outside the scope of this course because we're dealing with Istio, but I just want to remind you that it's actually pretty simple to encrypt the traffic between your user's browser and the load balancer. For example, if you're on AWS, then it's almost a case of clicking a couple of buttons and Amazon will automatically generate a certificate for you and you're almost done. It's almost as simple as that. If you are in any doubt about that, I will put a link to a YouTube video that I made as part of my Kubernetes course. I'm just putting that out there just to say, look, yeah, that is an important part of the equation, but it's not relevant to the inner workings of the cluster. HTTPS here is fine and is 99.9999% a requirement for any public-facing website. Even if the public don't understand that padlock, people have learnt not to trust sites that don't have a padlock on. We also have probably some kind of ingress gateway, which I'm not that worried about for this discussion, but it's easy enough to have a HTTPS connection between the load balancer and the ingress gateway. What I'm coming to is I think many people believe from here, now we're inside the cluster, from here, it would be fine to have unencrypted HTTP. Now, at first, that might sound like a reasonable argument. I don't know how you feel about that. Think about what HTTPS, encrypted traffic between the services, is achieving. It's there to prevent a man-in-the-middle attack, somebody getting in and intercepting the connection between the two. You might be able to argue that, hang on, we're inside a cluster. Now, if an attacker got to here, where I'm waving my mouse pointer, if an attacker were able to get into here and intercept the communication between the two, then they're inside our cluster already. And they're going to be able to do things like hack into the pods in any case. Now, that is a bad argument. I'll be explaining in a moment why it is a bad argument, but it's certainly an argument that many projects use to justify why they don't need to bother with HTTPS here. Now, let me be clear that actually without Istio, implementing HTTPS inside your cluster would be a nightmare. It would be really hard work because you're going to have to make sure that every single microservice is coded to send HTTPS traffic, and you're going to have to deal with issuing certificates to every single pod. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of the mechanics of that because I don't ever want to have to do that. That would be far too hard, and it would be risky as well, because you'd have to remember to do it for every single connection between every single microservice in your architecture. So my point I'm making there is, unless you've got something like Istio, I'm not actually surprised that many projects say, do you know what, this is a level of risk that we're happy to take. If an attacker got into the cluster and was able to intercept the traffic, they've got into the cluster anyway, and being able to intercept traffic between two pods is probably the least of our worries. As I say, that's a bad argument. I think it's finally time to explain why it's a bad argument. Well, a clue as to why comes from the fallacies of distributed computing that we referred to earlier in the course. Now, one of these fallacies, in other words, untruths that you should never believe, is that, it's the last one here, the network is either homogeneous or homogeneous. That's the bad assumption that your network is a single coherent entity. I've been deliberately on these captions waving my mouse pointer around and just saying, oh, here's our cluster, here's our cluster, here's our cluster, as if it's just a single block. I was deliberately trying to misdirect you there, because of course on most professional Kubernetes deployments are going to be multi-node deployments. So I hope this redrawing of the picture tells the story. If we're going to have a multi-node Kubernetes deployment, then of course those microservices are very likely going to be on different nodes. We have no real control over that. You can do some fiddling around in Kubernetes with node affinity, but in general that's something you really shouldn't be doing. So there's a very high probability that in that first network call that I was describing, that HTTP call is not just doing a local network trip, it's very likely leaving that node and going to a different node. Again, do you care about this? I would hope by now, if you didn't care before, that you are now starting to care. That's because we have no visibility. I'm assuming here you're deploying this to a cloud deployment. This may not be a problem if you're deploying to your own bare metal service that you've got control over, but assuming we're deploying to something like AWS, we have no way of knowing if this trip from this node here to this node here is going to leave a building. You might be assuming that these nodes are going to be on a rack in one data center, but we have no way of knowing that that's the case. What makes this even worse is many of you will be doing is deploying to a multi-zone deployment, a multi-availability zone deployment. So Amazon calls it availability zones. There's different terms on other cloud providers, but this means where you're deploying your system to different availability zones, which means different data centers. Now that's good practice for redundancy and resilience. So if one data center goes down, you know that the nodes in the other data center will survive. And one of the joys of Kubernetes is capable of rescheduling all of the lost pods to the surviving data centers. I'm sorry if I'm over explaining this. I know many of you will already be familiar with this, but it bears repeating. If you are doing a multi-availability zone deployment, then you are certainly, for 100% sure, this line that I've drawn here is leaving a building. And the fact it's leaving a building means that an attacker, where I'm waving my mouse pointer here, an attacker could get in here and could intercept the traffic. Now, it depends entirely on your system. If this microservice here is a credit card processing microservice, then we've got a potential vector of attack right here. Now you might, I'm going to explicitly edit the picture here so you can see me do it. I've made it now so that both of these nodes are in US East 1A. So you might argue, hey, resilience to data center failure is not important to us, so we'll just deploy everything to one availability zone. So you could argue that now there isn't the same availability zone, so therefore this line will not be leaving a building. I don't believe that that's a good argument. Cloud providers are very sensitive about releasing information like this, and I've only done a cursory bit of research around this. You might want to look deeper, but as far as I know, an availability zone in Amazon does not necessarily mean a single building. So even with the same availability zone, there is a non-zero probability that your traffic is going to be leaving a building somewhere. Even if we can establish that two nodes are going to be running in the same building, so there's no traffic leaving that building, then there is a potential that employees inside that building are able to intercept the traffic as it moves between the racks inside that data center. So this is hard, and we're talking about things here that we have no visibility of, and obviously a lot of this is kept private. But I think the point I'm making is, even if you think you can argue that your pod-to-pod traffic is never going to leave a building and is never going to be prone to a man-in-the-middle attack, I think you should assume it is. I suppose you could make an argument that if you're deploying to a single node, one node in your entire cluster, all of that traffic is running inside that node. And then maybe, just maybe, your argument that a man-in-the-middle attack there means that that attacker has breached the node, and therefore you've got far bigger security problems than them tapping the communications between the pods. They've got into the node. I'm not going to make that argument. I'm going to say, for safety, even if you think you're only deploying to a single node, which very few of you will be doing anyway, but even if you think you are, I would still assume that traffic might be leaving a building. So there's a very strong argument then that for a professional Kubernetes cluster, especially if you're going to be handling anything such as passwords or credit card data, that we really should be upgrading the cluster so that all traffic inside the cluster is upgraded to be HTTPS. Big problem with that, huge problem with that, is that would be an enormous amount of work. It would be more than tedious, but it would also be, I would argue, almost impossible to get it right. You'd only have to forget to apply this to one microservice, and then you've got a breach. So what can we do? Oh, you're here on an Istio course, aren't you? So I think we've got a solution for that.